I remember the first time I suspected something wasn't quite right. It wasn't a grand revelation or a gut punch moment. It was a subtle change, like the gentle slope of a hill you don't notice until you're already climbing it. My wife, Melissa, had grown quieter, more distant, and often lost in her thoughts. At first, I attributed it to the stress of work or just the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. We'd been together for 12 years, after all. People evolve, don't they? She would come home later than usual, explaining it away with excuses about working overtime or catching up with friends I hadn't heard her mention in years. I didn't push, believing her explanations were valid. I loved her and trusted her implicitly, until that trust began to feel misplaced. One evening, she came home with a glow I hadn't seen in a long time. Her eyes sparkled, her cheeks were flushed, and she hummed a tune I couldn't place. I playfully teased her, asking what had her in such a good mood. She smiled but gave me an evasive answer, mentioning some random detail about her day that didn't quite match her expression. My stomach churned slightly, but I brushed it off. Weeks passed, and the distance between us seemed to widen. Conversations became shallow. Our once effortless connection now felt strained. I began to notice little things. How she started dressing more carefully for her casual outings, how her phone never seemed to leave her hand, and how she smiled a bit too much at text messages I wasn't privy to. It wasn't until I saw a name flash on her phone, a name I vaguely recognized, that the quiet shift in our lives began to make sense. Her ex-husband, Eric. We'd spoken about him once or twice early in our relationship. They had a short-lived marriage, one of those youthful mistakes you laugh about over a glass of wine years later. She had told me they weren't even on speaking terms, so why was he calling her now? I didn't confront her then. Instead, I decided to watch, to gather pieces of the puzzle that had started to take shape in my mind. My heart clung to the hope that I was wrong, that I was overthinking things. After all, Melissa was my wife, my partner, my best friend. But sometimes, the quiet shifts are the loudest warnings. It wasn't long after I noticed Eric's name on her phone that the universe decided to test me. I was on my way home from work, later than usual, when I stopped by a local coffee shop to grab something to keep me awake. It was one of those dimly lit places, cozy yet unassuming, where the hum of quiet conversations created a pleasant white noise. I wasn't expecting to see her there. Melissa sat at a corner table, her back to the door, engrossed in conversation. Opposite her was a man I didn't recognize at first. He leaned in close, smiling in a way that made me instantly uncomfortable. As I stepped further inside, the light caught his face, and my heart sank. Eric. They looked too comfortable together. It wasn't the casual chat of old acquaintances bumping into each other by chance. It was intimate. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, close enough to his that the distance felt intentional, teasing, almost. I stayed frozen near the counter, my mind a storm of confusion. Should I walk over? Say something? My heart was screaming for answers, but my brain held me back. I grabbed my coffee and left, hoping they hadn't noticed me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of them together was burned into my mind. I wanted to ask her about it, but I also dreaded the answer. What if it really was just a coincidence? What if confronting her made me look paranoid, insecure? When she came home that evening, everything about her was normal. Too normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and chatted about some trivial details from work. But her smile was different. It wasn't the one I'd known for over a decade. It felt rehearsed, like the kind of smile you wear to hide something. Still, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Instead, I began to notice all the cracks in our foundation that I had ignored before. How often she excused herself to take phone calls in the other room. How she would occasionally disappear for an hour or two on the weekends with vague explanations of errands to run. I knew I couldn't sit in silence forever. If there was a truth to uncover, I needed to find it. But part of me still clung to the hope that I was wrong, that I would look back at this and laugh at my overactive imagination. The reality, though, was that I was beginning to brace for what I might find. My resolve to uncover the truth grew with each passing day. Melissa's behavior continued to tread the fine line between suspicious and explainable. I knew her well enough to catch the subtle changes. the faint scent of a different cologne on her clothes, the way she smiled to herself when she thought no one was watching. I needed proof. One evening, after she had gone to bed, I found myself staring at her phone charging on the kitchen counter. My heart raced as I considered unlocking it. Melissa and I had always been open about sharing passwords. It was one of those small gestures of trust we had never questioned. But now, I hesitated. I picked it up and unlocked it. Her messages were clean, nothing out of the ordinary. A slight wave of relief washed over me until I noticed the name buried in her recent call logs. Eric. There it was again, mocking me, as if daring me to dig deeper. I checked her calendar. She had an appointment scheduled for the upcoming Friday evening. It was labeled dinner with old friends, something she hadn't mentioned to me. I decided I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I made a plan to follow her. Friday evening arrived, and I played my part well. I kissed her goodbye and wished her a fun night out. "Don't wait up," she said with a casual smile. I waited 20 minutes before leaving the house. Her car was easy to spot, and I kept a safe distance as I followed her. It felt surreal, like I was in someone else's life, doing something I never imagined I'd have to do. She pulled into a neighborhood I didn't recognize and parked outside a modest, well-kept house. I stayed in my car, far enough away to avoid being seen, but close enough to keep her in view. And then I saw him. Eric stepped out onto the porch, his face illuminated by the porch light. He smiled warmly as Melissa approached, and they shared an embrace that lasted a beat too long. They went inside, and the door closed behind them. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to storm up to that house, demand answers, make them face the betrayal. But I knew that wasn't the way. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of her car in the driveway. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When Melissa returned home later that night, I pretended to be asleep. She slipped into bed beside me, her scent now unmistakably different, an unfamiliar mixture of Eric's cologne and her perfume. I stared at the ceiling, my suspicions now a cold, hard truth I couldn't ignore. The days following her visit to Eric's house were a blur of conflicting emotions. I swung between rage, heartbreak, and a strange sense of determination. If this was happening, I needed more than suspicions and a single photo. I needed the truth, the full, undeniable truth. Melissa acted as if nothing had changed. She was cheerful at breakfast, asked about my plans for the day, and even brought up a weekend getaway she wanted us to take in the coming months. It was surreal, watching her maintain this facade while I knew where she had been and with whom. I started paying closer attention to the details I might have missed before. Her phone rarely left her side now. She would glance at it during dinner, her expression softening slightly before she quickly turned it face down. She spent longer in the shower, and her laughter came more easily when she thought I wasn't listening. One evening, I decided to test the waters. As we sat on the couch watching a show, I casually mentioned her dinner with old friends the previous Friday. "How was it?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. "It was nice," she replied, her eyes fixed on the TV. "Just a few of the girls catching up. You know how it is." I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. "That's great. Where'd you guys go?" She faltered again, barely noticeable, before naming a restaurant across town. My heart sank further. I knew the lie for what it was. "That sounds nice," I said, letting the subject drop. Later that night, after she had fallen asleep, I went back to her phone. This time, I checked her location history. As I suspected, there was no record of her being at the restaurant she had mentioned. The trail stopped at Eric's house. I saved the location history and took screenshots of her messages, which still didn't reveal much. Then I opened her photos. There, tucked into an album I hadn't noticed before, were a handful of pictures, Melissa and Eric together, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years. One photo stood out among the rest. The two of them sitting on a couch, her head resting on his shoulder. It wasn't explicit, but it was intimate enough to feel like a knife in my chest. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. I still didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but I had seen enough to understand one thing clearly. My wife wasn't just visiting her ex-husband. This was more than reconnecting. This was something I might never be able to forgive. The weight of her betrayal was becoming unbearable. Every glance she threw my way, every touch, every laugh, everything felt tainted. I began to question how long it had been going on, how I could have missed it, and whether it was my fault for not seeing the signs earlier. I knew I couldn't keep playing the silent observer. The evidence I had gathered was enough to confirm my worst fears, but it wasn't enough to confront her, not yet. I needed clarity, and for that, I needed someone who knew Melissa as well as I did, or thought they did. I reached out to one of her close friends, Julie, under the pretense of catching up. Julie and Melissa had been inseparable for years, and I figured if anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. We met for coffee on a quiet afternoon, the air thick with anticipation. Julie greeted me warmly, but her expression shifted when I brought up Melissa. "How's she been?" I asked casually. Julie hesitated. "She's okay, I guess. Why do you ask?" "I just feel like she's been distant lately," I admitted, keeping my tone even. "I thought maybe she's mentioned something to you." Julie's eyes darted away, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. "Not really," she said. "I mean, she's been busy with work and other things." "Other things?" I pressed gently. She fidgeted with her cup. "I don't know, honestly. She's been a little off. But maybe I'm imagining it." Her hesitation spoke volumes, but I decided not to push further. If she knew something, she wasn't ready to share it. Still, the encounter left me more certain than ever that I wasn't imagining things. Melissa wasn't just distant. She was hiding something significant. That evening, I began considering my next move. I had been avoiding the confrontation, hoping for an explanation that wouldn't shatter my world, but I realized that hope was futile. The truth was out there, and it wasn't going to come to me on its own. I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I needed to know the full extent of what was happening behind my back. If there was more to this than stolen glances and secret dinners, I couldn't live in the dark any longer. The investigator was professional and discreet, assuring me that they would uncover everything I needed to know. It was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. I was desperate for answers, but I also feared what they would reveal. Melissa, meanwhile, continued to act as though everything was normal. She planned our meals, talked about her work, and even suggested we start planning for the holidays. Every word out of her mouth felt like a slap, a reminder of the trust she was breaking while pretending to build a future together. For the first time in our marriage, I found myself pulling away from her. I didn't touch her, didn't kiss her, didn't laugh at her jokes, and she noticed. One night, as we sat silently in the living room, she finally asked, "Is everything okay with us?" I forced a smile, one that I hoped masked the storm raging inside me. "I've just been tired from work," I lied. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Little did she know, I was preparing for the moment that would lay everything bare. The moment I would no longer have to pretend. Days turned into weeks as the private investigator worked quietly in the background. Each time my phone buzzed with a message or call, my heart jumped, wondering if it was the update that would confirm my worst fears, or perhaps bring an unexpected explanation. I started noticing small changes in Melissa's demeanor. She seemed more cautious, watching me with an intensity that felt out of place. It was as if she could sense the growing wall between us. Her attempts to engage me became more frequent, but they felt calculated, like she was trying to gauge how much I knew without tipping her hand. One evening, she sat beside me on the couch and leaned in closer than usual. "I feel like we've been off lately," she said, her voice soft. I kept my expression neutral. "Do you think so?" She hesitated, searching my face. "Yeah, I don't know. You've been distant." I shrugged. "Work's been stressful. Maybe that's it." She studied me for a moment longer before nodding, but I could tell she didn't buy it. The tension between us grew heavier with each passing day. I found myself wondering if she was beginning to unravel, if the guilt of her secrets was finally getting to her. Or maybe she was just testing me, trying to figure out if I knew. A week later, the private investigator called. "I've got what you need," he said, his tone professional but tinged with sympathy. "Do you want to meet to go over everything?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. We met in his small, unassuming office the next day. He handed me a folder, thick with photos, documents, and notes. I opened it with trembling hands, my stomach churning as I flipped through the contents. There were photos of Melissa entering Eric's house on multiple occasions, staying for hours at a time. Some images showed them in his backyard, sharing what looked like intimate moments, his hand on her lower back, her head resting on his shoulder. But the one that hit me hardest was a photo of them kissing. It wasn't just a peck or a fleeting touch. It was passionate, undeniable. The investigator explained that he'd observed them meeting regularly over the past month, often under the guise of her work commitments or girls' nights. They were careful but not careful enough. I sat there in silence, staring at the evidence, my mind racing. The truth was no longer a question. It was staring me in the face. The investigator leaned forward. I know this is a lot to take in. If you need any additional documentation or support, just let me know. I nodded, barely able to form words. Thank you. Driving home that day felt surreal. The world outside seemed unchanged, oblivious to the turmoil in my life. But inside, everything was unraveling. Melissa was waiting for me when I got home, a warm smile on her face as she greeted me. She kissed my cheek, and for the first time, I felt nothing but anger and sadness. I knew that the time for silence was coming to an end. The folder sat on the dining table like a ticking time bomb. I had placed it there deliberately, in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to detonate the illusion Melissa and I had been living in. That evening, I asked her to sit down. The way her eyes darted to the folder and back to me told me she knew something was wrong. Still, she sat, smoothing her dress and offering a small, nervous smile. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone forced casual. I slid the folder across the table. "Open it." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. When she opened it and the photos spilled out, her face went pale. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. "Eric," I said, my voice calm but cold. "You've been seeing him. At his house. Repeatedly. I know everything." She blinked rapidly, her expression shifting between panic and disbelief. It's not what it looks like," she stammered. I slammed my hand on the table, making her jump. "Don't insult me by lying, Melissa. I've seen the pictures. I know about the messages. I know about the nights you claim to be working late or meeting friends. It's all here." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me, her lips trembling. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I demanded. "The late nights? The lies? The betrayal? Or was it when you decided to rekindle something with the man you swore was nothing more than a mistake from your past?" She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said through her tears. I felt so lost. And Eric, he was there. He understood me in a way I felt you didn't anymore." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I had always thought I knew her, that our connection was strong enough to weather anything. But now, I realized how deeply fractured it had become. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling. She hesitated before answering. "A few months." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her confession settling over me. "Why? Why would you do this to us?" She wiped at her tears, her gaze fixed on the table. "I don't know," she said softly. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. And I couldn't stop." I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "Do you love him?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "No, it's not like that." Then what is it like?" I interrupted. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like you've thrown away everything we built together for." "What? Nostalgia? Excitement?" She didn't answer, her silence confirming everything I needed to know. "I want you out of this house," I said finally. "You can pack your things and go to him, to wherever you want. But you and we're done." She started sobbing again, pleading with me to reconsider, to let her explain, to give her another chance. But her words fell on deaf ears. I walked out of the room, leaving her to face the reality of her choices alone. The house felt unbearably quiet after our confrontation. Melissa hadn't left yet. She lingered like a shadow, pleading and bargaining with every word and gesture. But I was beyond persuasion. The weight of her betrayal was suffocating, and I could no longer see her as the woman I had built my life with. 2 days later, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, and it didn't come from Melissa. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello? Is this Jason?" The voice on the other end asked. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Eric." My blood turned to ice. Of all the ways I had imagined this playing out, Eric calling me wasn't one of them. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice tight. He hesitated, then sighed. "I think we need to talk. In person." I almost hung up, but curiosity got the better of me. "Why would I meet with you?" "Because I think you deserve the truth," he said simply. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from him in a small diner. He looked tired, his confident demeanor muted. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I'm not here to cause more pain," he began. I thought you should hear it from me." "Hear what?" I snapped. "That you've been sleeping with my wife? That you've been lying to my face and to hers?" He flinched but didn't argue. "I won't deny what happened," he said quietly, "but I never meant for it to go this far." "What exactly does that mean?" I demanded, my anger bubbling to the surface. "It started innocently, I guess. She reached out to me months ago. At first, it was just catching up, talking about old times. But then it got complicated." "Complicated?" I echoed bitterly. He nodded, avoiding my gaze. "She wasn't happy, Jason. She told me things about your marriage, about how distant you'd become. And I—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," I interrupted, my voice low but firm. "I'm not the one who broke my vows. I'm not the one sneaking around behind my partner's back." Eric looked chastened but continued. "I know. You're right. I got caught up in it. I thought maybe we could rekindle what we had, but it wasn't real. I see that now." I leaned back, trying to process his words. "So why are you telling me this? What do you gain from coming clean now?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Because Melissa isn't coming back to me. She told me yesterday that she's staying with you, that she wants to fix things with you. And I can't be part of her life if that's what she's choosing." His words hit me like a brick. Melissa hadn't mentioned anything about wanting to stay. If anything, she had been silent since I told her to leave. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know everything," Eric added, "even if it hurts. I'm sorry for what I've done. Truly." I stared at him for a long moment, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to punch him, to scream at him for the pain he had caused. But another part of me felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. When I returned home that evening, Melissa was waiting for me in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "I talked to Eric," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Her face crumpled, and she began to sob. "Jason, please. I made a mistake. I want to make this right. I'll do anything." But her words no longer mattered. I had already made my decision. Melissa's pleas echoed in the room, but they felt hollow, like the desperate cries of someone who had already lost. She begged for forgiveness, for another chance, for the life we once shared. But no amount of words could undo the damage. "I don't trust you anymore," I said firmly. "You didn't just break your vows, you broke us. And I can't rebuild something on shattered foundations." She fell silent, her sobs subsiding into quiet sniffles. "So that's it," she whispered. "You're just giving up?" "I'm not giving up," I replied, my voice steady. "You did that the moment you walked into his house." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked defeated. "I'll leave," she said softly, "if that's what you want." "That's what I want," I said, feeling the finality of the words settle over us. The next morning, she packed her things. I watched from the living room as she moved methodically through the house, collecting pieces of a life we had built together. It was surreal, watching her erase herself from our home. When she was done, she stood by the door, suitcase in hand. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice trembling, "but I hope one day you'll find peace." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and walked out the door. I watched as she got into her car and drove away, the weight of her absence filling the house like a heavy fog. Over the next few days, I tried to adjust to life without her. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Every corner held memories of a love that now felt like a cruel joke. I buried myself in work, in projects, in anything that would keep me from thinking about her. And yet, she wasn't gone. Melissa began texting me. Long messages filled with apologies and promises to change. She told me she wasn't staying with Eric, that she had cut ties with him completely. But I didn't care. I had made my decision, and there was no going back. Then, a week later, I received a message from Eric. "She's here." The text was short but clear. Melissa had gone to him after all. Part of me felt vindicated, as if her actions confirmed that I had made the right choice. But another part of me, one I didn't want to acknowledge, felt the sting of betrayal all over again. That night, I sat alone in the house, replaying everything that had happened. I thought about the life we had shared, the promises we had made, and the love I thought would last forever. But that life was gone now, replaced by a painful new reality. As I stared out the window at the quiet street, I realized something. Melissa had run away, not just from me, but from the consequences of her choices. And in doing so, she had set me free. The days that followed Melissa's departure were a blur of emptiness and introspection. With her gone, I no longer had to contend with her presence or her attempts at reconciliation. But the void she left behind was suffocating in its own way. I found myself replaying the moments that led to this point, dissecting every interaction, every decision, every missed sign. There were times I felt anger, at her, at Eric, at myself for being blind to the cracks that had formed long before her betrayal became undeniable. But there were also moments of clarity. One evening, I sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand, and scrolled through old photos on my phone. Smiling faces, shared vacations, silly selfies. It all seemed like a distant life. And yet, as I stared at those images, I realized that the love we once had wasn't a lie. It had been real, but somewhere along the way, it had unraveled. I began therapy at the suggestion of a close friend. At first, it felt strange, opening up to a stranger about something so deeply personal. But as I talked, I began to see patterns, moments where things could have been different. I wasn't to blame for Melissa's choices, but I also wasn't blameless in the distance that had grown between us. "I feel like a failure," I admitted during one session, like I couldn't hold onto the one thing that mattered most. The therapist leaned forward, her expression compassionate. "Failure isn't about the end result, Jason. It's about whether or not you learn from what happened. What have you learned?" I thought about her question long after the session ended. A month passed, and I started reclaiming my life. I cleared out the house, removing reminders of our shared past that felt too painful to keep. I took up running, rediscovering the simple joy of moving forward, step by step, mile by mile. Friends and family rallied around me, offering support in ways I hadn't anticipated. My sister invited me over for dinner every week, her kids' laughter a welcome distraction from the silence at home. My best friend dragged me to a concert, insisting I needed to live a little. Through it all, Melissa remained in the background, a ghost I couldn't fully exorcise. She still sent the occasional text, though they grew shorter and less frequent. I never responded. One day, I received an unexpected message from Eric. "She's leaving town." I stared at the words for a long time, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over me. Her leaving felt like the final chapter of a book I hadn't wanted to finish. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. As time passed, I found myself thinking less about Melissa and more about what came next. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it also felt like mine. Months had passed since Melissa left my life for good. The weight of her betrayal, though still lingering in quiet moments, no longer consumed me. The house, once a painful reminder of what I had lost, began to feel like my own again. I filled the empty spaces with new memories, new experiences, and slowly, I started to rebuild. I never heard from her again after Eric's message about her leaving town. part of me had wanted closure, a final conversation to tie up the loose ends of our shattered relationship. But another part of me understood that closure wasn't something she could give me. It was something I had to find within myself. Therapy helped. It gave me the tools to process my grief and anger, to recognize the lessons hidden within the pain. I learned to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made in our marriage and to let go of the guilt that had weighed me down for so long. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, I stumbled upon a photo album from the early days of our relationship. I flipped through it slowly, pausing on a picture of us at the beach. We looked so happy, so carefree. I smiled faintly, not out of longing, but out of gratitude. Those moments had been real, even if they had ultimately led to heartbreak. I decided to keep the album, not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder of the journey that had brought me to where I was now. Over time, I began to rediscover myself. I threw myself into hobbies I had neglected: gardening, cooking, even learning to play the guitar. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones, surrounding myself with people who reminded me of the joy that life still held. One day, while out for a run, I met someone. Her name was Claire, and she had a smile that felt like sunlight cutting through a storm. We started talking, first casually, then more often. There was no rush, no pressure, just the easy, natural rhythm of two people getting to know each other. Claire wasn't a replacement for what I had lost. She was something entirely new. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Looking back, I realized that Melissa's betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had transformed me. It forced me to confront truths about myself and my life that I might have otherwise ignored. It was painful, yes, but it was also a turning point, a chance to start again. As I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The past was behind me, but the future? The future was wide open.